Good evening. There we go. I want to thank each of you for coming out this evening for actually the last lecture that we're going to have in our evening lecture series. I want to thank Dick Faust for all the work that he's done over the past 10 years or so, recording all of these things, putting them on YouTube. So any of these lectures that we've had, we have recorded and have those available, and this one will be as well. And we have a very special one. I note that they're having, I believe, a debate. Supreme Court justices debating out there, but we have an even greater event in here this evening. Burnis R. Morris is the Carter G. Woodson Professor and co-founder of the Dr. Carter G. Woodson Lyceum in the W. Page Pitt School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Marshall University. He has been a distinguished John Deaver Drinko Fellow at Marshall, a Carter G. Woodson Fellow at Emory University, and the recipient of a West Virginia Humanities Council Fellowship. He also received the Distinguished Artists and Scholars Award for senior faculty at Marshall and a grant from the Humanities Council to create a summer institute for Black history instruction, which he conducted June 6th through the 9th in 2017, and he was in fact brought that group here. We were delighted to have them. Professor Morris received a master's degree in public administration at the University of Dayton and a bachelor's degree in journalism at the University of Mississippi, where he became the first black student there to be selected to Who's Who among students in American colleges and universities. Before his employment in the academic world, Morris served as a New York Times intern and as a reporter and editor, and in executive positions at several newspapers owned by Cox Enterprises. He is the author of 3 books, most recently Carter G. Woodson, History, the Black Press, and Public Relations. We are delighted to have with us this evening Professor Burnis R. Morris.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you, Joe. I forgot to tell you, though, that I was Cadet of the Year in high school ROTC. I would like to just recognize some of my colleagues at Marshall University who came to cheer me on tonight. Montserrat Miller, Executive Director of the John Deaver Drinko Academy. Would you raise your hand, Montserrat? Dan Holbrook of the History Department at Marshall, and Rob Raby, the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. You guys want to hear about Carter G. Woodson, I suppose. That's the reason you came. And I should warn you that in early August, I was hit with laryngitis, and it lasted for more than a month. And I'm back to normal now, and so I'm trying to catch up, so I might be long-winded. The idea for the study of Dr. Carter G. Woodson evolved from a chance encounter on a visit to the Underground Railroad Museum in Cincinnati during the national holiday honoring the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in 2011. My encounter was with The Miseducation of the Negro, Woodson's most popular book, which I saw in the museum's gift shop, a book I had not read for several years. For many African Americans in higher education, as well as others in pop culture, Miseducation of the Negro is regarded as a kind of manifesto. Woodson's name is no longer a household name, but the book's title has taken a life of its own. There are more than 500,000 copies of the book in print, and the title not only is used by many people who feel society has deprived African Americans of their rights to a proper education, but it now can refer to people who have had bad relationships and blame one another for abuses. It can even mean the people with whom you disagree have pronounced shortcomings. You ever use that phrase? You know, they just are miseducated. And remember the album? Well, some of you may. People who are younger than me, I didn't buy this album, but my students and others tell me that the miseducation of Lauryn Hill, some of you may have heard that on the radio, or that was probably MTV days. She used the title, and she clearly was referring to Woodson's miseducation of the Negro, but in her case, it was about her bad relationships. There have been so many studies of Woodson and miseducation of the Negro that I knew that if I was going to tackle this topic, I would need a fresh approach. And I came up with an idea no one had done. Professors always claim no one has done this research, and that's their argument for being published. But I truly believe this, and they always say that too. But the more I read and reread Woodson's 1933 book, the more I realized that a major reason for his success in popularizing black history was his collaboration with the mass media. Woodson had grown up with newspapers, read them to illiterate coal miners in West Virginia during his 6-year apprenticeship as a teenager. Woodson's father, James Henry Woodson, was one of the illiterate people to whom Woodson had read newspapers. His father was one of the former slaves who moved to the area that became Huntington in 1870 to help College P. Huntington complete the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. The family remained in Huntington for several years after its founding, but moved back to Virginia, probably because of the unhealthy living conditions during the early years of Huntington. Carter Godwin Woodson was born in New Canton, Virginia, on December 19th, 1875, and died at his Washington, D.C. home on April 3rd, 1950, at the age of 74. Later, I will show you a letter that I believe is the final letter that Woodson wrote on April 1st, 1950, and some of the concerns he had at the end of his life. Dr. Woodson's early years, 1875 to 1903, basically this period is from when he was born in New Canton, Virginia, to his departure from Huntington in 1903, include the time he spent in Huntington and nearby communities, places where he lived, worked, and studied, and where he acquired the foundations for the Black History movement, the label we give much of his work. His West Virginia years involved the period before he became a world traveler and citizen of the world. Many of you are probably unaware there was a Black History movement, but I argue that you do, and that you just don't know it by that name. You know it by the name Black History Month, which he founded in 1926 as Negro History Week. You also know it and Woodson by their results and impact on education. Most schools recognize Black history today because of Woodson. His movement encouraged many Americans to learn about their past, and the technology and science, DNA, for example, have caught up with what Woodson set out to accomplish. You should also know Woodson by his tribute to Booker T. Washington. Woodson was the main speaker at dedication of a shrine honoring Washington in 1932 in Malden. Blacks and whites from all over gathered in Malden for the dedication. The speech was covered by the New York Times and other newspapers. Woodson used the occasion to praise West Virginia and criticized his native Virginia. The newspaper quoted Woodson as saying, it said that Dr. Woodson declared that West Virginia was fortunate in having Washington settle there, and Washington likewise was fortunate in growing up here in this atmosphere of more liberty than that of the state from which he came. Woodson was fond of telling friends that his move to West Virginia had been a turning point in his career. If you allow me, I will revise Woodson's statement and say that Woodson's West Virginia period, considering what he accomplished, was a turning point in black history. American education when Woodson was growing up in Virginia and West Virginia was filled with white supremacist ideas. And Woodson said he had been taught the same theories of black inferiority as other students, but he handled the misinformation better than most because he had been well-grounded. He mastered critical thinking before it became an academic cliche. His father's principles put blacks and whites on equal footing, and that often meant hardship. But Carter said his father believed that such a life was more honorable than to serve one as a menial. At 12 years old, Carter Woodson read a story in a McGuffey reader. Anyone in here learn reading that way? I know some people who did. This story involved two boys, George Jones and Charles Bullard, with moral religious overtones. The Bullard character studied his lessons before going out to play, which he played well, and he was popular, went off to college, became class valedictorian, and had great success in life. Jones, on the other hand, did not study and played games poorly. He was not well liked and was a failure. After he finished reading the story, Woodson decided, I'm going to be Charles Bullard, and set his sights on college. Carter attended Huntington's Douglas School and was frequently absent because he was off working in the coal fields. But he said he studied Virgil and Caesar on his own. He tested well and received a diploma after about a year of a 2-year program in 1896. After receiving his diploma, Woodson studied at Berea College in Kentucky and briefly at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania before moving to Fayette County and teaching high school in Winona. He served as a Sunday school teacher and president of the Board of Deacons of the First Baptist Church in Winona. In 1900, Carter H. Barnett, a Woodson first cousin, was fired as principal of Douglas High School because of his politics. If you ask me after I'm done, some of the details of that, I'll gladly get into how and why Barnett was fired. While principal, Woodson gained recognition in the local press when he honored William McKinley in a special service at the Douglas School following the president's death in 1901. He sketched McKinley's biography and suggested singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee." In private life, Woodson continued to read aloud to his father and was said to bring breakfast to him at his railroad job on Sundays. Woodson completed the 2-year degree at Berea in 1903. He saw Booker T. Washington for the first time in Lexington, Kentucky that year, and was impressed by Washington's oratory. Woodson was struck by Washington's doubts about the ability of blacks to remain free or avoid extinction. In the meantime, Woodson was off to the Philippines as a teacher and supervisor of education in 1903. He visited Huntington several times over the next 47 years of his life and owned real estate for several years until his death. In 1920, he was fired for insubordination as dean at Howard University, and he returned to this state as a resident that year and took a similar job at what's now called West Virginia State University as dean. He stayed at State until 1922 when he moved back to Washington. My study of Woodson and the press evolved after my exit through the gift shop of the Underground Railroad Museum and covers the details and significance of the role played by the black press in helping to bring success to Woodson's program. My study primarily covers the final half of Woodson's life, when he emerged as a leading scholar and newsmaker. It is a remarkable coincidence that Cincinnati connects my chance encounter to Woodson's work. Cincinnati, surprisingly, had figured prominently in Woodson's research. The first full-length article published in the scholarly journal he founded, the Journal of Negro History, in 1916, was The Negroes of Cincinnati Prior to the Civil War. Woodson demonstrated uses for the press in research and roles played by white-owned news publications whose files assist historians in documenting history. Woodson would later advocate the same uses and roles for black publications. Many African Americans and their news publications were often negligent in preserving information Woodson believed would help document their community's past. Woodson demonstrated how reliable newspapers could be and used to help everyone rediscover their history. Recognizing the important role of the black press, Woodson thus challenged black journalists to correct their major weakness by preserving their published articles to document success of the black experience. Woodson used his experience, his expertise as a historian, and his skills as a journalist and publicist to attack ignorance and inequality. Using historical research to correct mistakes about black history and serving as an advocate for improving education, Woodson launched a public education program and helped change attitudes about African Americans. Woodson leaned heavily on one independent institution, the weekly newspapers, among the oldest and most powerful organizations in the black community. Black churches also were powerful, but Woodson fought with their leaders, many of whom Woodson considered corrupt and unprepared to lead their churches. During his era, 1915 to 1950, Woodson cultivated and won crucial press support for his movement. In doing so, he merged his program's interests and the interests of the black newspapers. His cause became their cause, and he became the father of black history. The influence of the black press was expanding just as Woodson was founding the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915. Educating readers about their past through Woodson helped build newspaper audiences as a result of this union with the association he founded. One way newspapers could demonstrate black achievements was in the printing of obituaries, which Woodson advocated and referred to as biographical sketches. He demonstrated his preferred style for obituaries in the Journal of Negro History and the Negro History Bulletin. Concerned that newspapers might neglect their duties, Woodson encouraged local affiliates of his organization to save such records as old newspapers, receipts, manumission papers, deeds, and wills, and association members were asked to, quote, write the life histories of the near great but useful Negroes of whom editors and authors take no account. That sounds somewhat snobbish, but if you're a Harvard professor or Harvard PhD, I'm sorry, you can sound like that, I guess. Often, he had the last word on many of the people who had supported him. Robert S. Abbott and Oswald Garrison Villard, for example, and those who opposed him or with whom he disagreed. Kelly Miller and Thomas Jesse Jones. His instructions to journalists and others stipulated objectivity, removing the observer's personal opinions and balancing the good with the bad in writing the obituaries. And he demonstrated how it should be done in obituaries he published with and without his signature in his magazines. No byline was listed for many of the obituaries, but those printed were written in Woodson's style. Woodson wrote that Kelly Miller, a columnist and Howard University professor, was one of the important men of the entire country. Yet he faulted Miller for his lack of scholarship in many of the areas in which he provided commentaries, and as his being trained as a mathematician, but speaking most often in areas of sociology in which he was not trained. Of Abbott, there is a Kelly Miller High School in West Virginia, by the way. Phil Carter, who's a professor and former athlete at Marshall, went to Kelly Miller's school. Of Abbott, the Journal recognized his strong contributions to the black press and cited the rise of his newspaper's circulation above 200,000, making him one of the richest African Americans. The obituary suggested Abbott's accomplishments were the standard by which black newspapers should be judged. In writing Villard's obituary, Woodson noted Villard was the grandson of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and compared him unfavorably to his grandfather, the editor of The Liberator, largely because Villard had accumulated great wealth. Woodson, however, did praise Villard for his support of his association and other causes beneficial to blacks. Woodson said, "To organizations thus battling for opportunity and freedom for American Negroes, he gave not only his time, but a considerable portion of his means." Thomas Jesse Jones's obituary was published in the same issue as Villard's, and coming toward the end of Woodson's life, serves as a test of Woodson's principle of reporting both the good and the bad of people's lives. Jones, whom Woodson had blamed for his loss of philanthropic support, also was accused of forcing his ideas on black education in America and Africa and for inflicting cruelty against those who disagreed with them. Woodson, however, credited Jones for some success, but it was an obituary filled mostly with criticism. Still, it fell within the broad outlines of Woodson's requirements for obituaries because it showed both sides of Jones. But I'll let you decide on your own. I call it balanced. You may disagree. The obituary stated that Jones would have achieved greater success, quote, if he had not been so narrow-minded, short-sighted, vindictive, and undermining. Rarely would a Negro leader in the United States speak commendably of such an unscrupulous man. I will share some photos of Woodson in a few minutes and a video and let you hear Woodson's voice. These are the only examples that I've seen anywhere that have survived. I don't know if he made more. But first I want to tell you about my new Woodson project. I'm calling it the Carter G. Woodson century of making Black lives matter. I am arguing that Black history movement Woodson founded was a Black Lives Matter cause. My research discusses Black historiography before and after Woodson's imprint, and I associate Woodson's ideas with significant changes that occurred in the teaching of history and rehabilitation of the African American image over several decades. Woodson's ideas had an intergenerational impact on education, not just Black education, and he influenced Black ideology over several generations. In short, I am arguing that Woodson should be viewed in a much larger framework than someone who wanted Black history courses included in school curriculums and annual celebrations of a week or a month of Black contributions in history. He was actually interested in the present and future of the Black race. He was driven by a deep concern about the devaluation of Black lives and culture. He was not interested in merely having people memorize dates or delving into statistics. Even several among the handful of college professors teaching Black history in Woodson's time did not comprehend Woodson's cause. In response to a colleague at a Black college who thought Woodson failed to recognize his institution was offering Black history courses, Woodson countered that his plan was bigger than offering courses. Quote, he said, "I have in mind the larger problem of the thorough education of the Negro in the light of what he is and what he hopes to be." Woodson was as important to the overall education and empowerment of African Americans in their pursuit of justice and equality as he was to restoration of accurate accounts of the Black past. In fact, they were indistinguishable in Woodson's point of view. Woodson wasn't just interested in Marshall University offering Black history courses. He would be interested in African American studies and Africana studies. And Dan Holbrook, former chair of history, named your program African American Studies. Am I correct, Dan? I don't know if Dan understood that Woodson, this was Woodson's original thought, and Woodson is given credit for the creation of African American Studies programs across the country. Comparison, understandably, will be made to other social justice causes. The Woodson program antedates, particularly the Black Lives Matter activism of recent years. Without question, their concerns overlap. Both battled mistreatment and murders of Black citizens. The Black Lives Movement and Woodson's concerns may also be compared to the anti-lynching movement of journalist Ida B. Wells, whose opposition to white vigilante justice against Blacks in 1892 led to the vandalizing of her Memphis newspaper. She headed an international campaign against lynching and was a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. Although she complained in her diary that Woodson did not acknowledge her work in this area, Wells was one of his supporters and attended at least one Negro History Club meeting in 1930. Wells also was president of the Negro Fellowship League in Chicago, where she relocated after Memphis, and Woodson spoke to the Fellowship League in 1915 on his first book promotion. The NAACP estimated that more than 2,500 African Americans were lynched from 1885 to 1918, but Woodson compared protests against lynching unfavorably to his Black history movement. He used a racist education system as a metaphor for violence against black minds, declaring his movement was, quote, much more important than the anti-lynching movement because there would be no lynching if it did not start in the schoolroom. As this story suggests, Woodson was more than the progenitor of black history. The Woodson program, in his mind, was intended to prevent the black extermination he had feared was possible. John Hope Franklin, who was mentored by Woodson, argued Woodson's contributions to American historiography were significant and far-reaching, and that the program for rehabilitating the place of the Negro in American history has been stimulated immeasurably by his diverse and effective efforts. And he stated that because of Woodson's work, for the first time in the history of the United States, there is a striking resemblance between what historians are writing and what has actually happened in the history of the American Negro. Jacqueline Goggin, Woodson's most significant biographer, found that Woodson's success in correcting the historical record and his use of census data, marriage registers, birth and death certificates, letters, diaries, and oral histories in his research caused other historians to consider Woodson's approach. Typically, Goggin wrote, Woodson provided coverage on all aspects of the black experience. Woodson was also a leader in publishing journal articles involving women. During the Woodson years, his Journal of Negro History published more articles by women writers and subjects about women than any other major historical journal, Goggins pointed out. Among the most notable skeptics of Woodson's program was Gunnar Myrdal, later a Nobel Prize winner in economics, whose study of America's race problems was considered required reading for much of the 20th century. In American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, Myrdal argued that many in the black history movement were engaged in propaganda activities, and he complained their enthusiasm in promoting black accomplishments and racial pride was divisive. You know, I guess Myrdal never heard the fact that we had segregation in those days. We were already divided. Woodson, in rejecting Myrdal's criticism, questioned the validity of Myrdal's research and methodology, noting the Swedish author had few contacts with blacks. Woodson also charged Myrdal's study misinformed the public. And he could also say he was miseducated, right? And he challenged Myrdal's thoroughness. What the work contains has much value beyond the shadow of a doubt, but what it does not contain would have been a nearer approach to the truth. The world is suffering today from many ills which have resulted from the half-truth. An American Dilemma ungenerously complimented Woodson in a footnote, quoting an article by one of the historians Woodson mentored. Lawrence Reddick, curator of the Schomburg collection at New York Public Library. And the quotation cited is, "The history of Negro historiography falls into two divisions, before Woodson and after Woodson." The fact that Woodson dominated the black historiography field for so long does lead to discussion of only two periods or divisions. The first division was marked by blacks being systematically denied basic rights of citizenship, aided by biased, unsavory white historians. These historians were described by John Hope Franklin as, quote, willing accomplices in the conspiracy to degrade a whole race of men. Racism and disrespect ran through all segments of white society, from uneducated to the elite. For instance, Theodore Roosevelt, who later would be both praised for his bravery and vilified for inviting a black man, Booker T. Washington, to dinner at the White House, said in 1895, years before he became president, "A perfectly stupid race can never rise to a very high plane. The Negro, for instance, has been kept down as much by lack of intellectual development as anything else." Woodson believed that in the first period of black history, African Americans faced extermination or extinction. In period 2 of black history, Woodson crafted an intervention program that began September 9th, 1915, with the founding of the association, when Woodson began to crusade as teacher, scholar, and promoter, contradicting myths of black inferiority and depiction as society's burdens. Woodson called his announcement of the founding of his association, quote, he recalled his founding, it proclaimed as its purposes the collection of sociological and historical data on the Negro, the study of peoples of African blood, the publishing of books in this field, and the promotion of harmony between the races. In the 1940s, his final decade, Woodson was deeply concerned that his Negro History Week creation had become so popular that it was gaining interest among charlatans and exploiters who had different interests, and for good reason. Many Communist Party members in the 1940s tried to claim Negro History Week was the party's invention, and party members tried to seize control of several of Woodson's branches in the late 40s and early 1950s, when they openly competed with Woodson's association in celebrating Negro History Week in New York. Woodson successfully bequeathed the benefits of his work to posterity. His approach to history, one of his biographers observed, became a practical tool of self-empowerment and liberation, and his contributions served as useful object lessons for practitioners of the modern Black Studies movement. Dimensions of Woodson's approach can be beneficially adapted to Black Studies paradigms of the 21st century. Woodson has been praised for his work molding an understudy group of younger historians who followed him and set their own mark. The most honored historian of this group, John Hope Franklin, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton. Woodson's book, The Negro in Our History, dominated the Black history field for at least 25 years until it was supplanted by a Franklin book, From Slavery to Freedom, a history of African Americans, published in 1947. Concern for how scholars would eventually treat African Americans in their studies was uppermost in Woodson's mind during his final years. His review of Storm Over the Land, a profile of the Civil War, a book by Carl Sandburg, illustrated this point. Woodson wrote admiringly, quote, "It is very much a humanized story. Even the Negro, something unusual for an American history, is made an actor in this drama. The Negro figures as a person rather than merely as a thing about which there was a much regretted quarrel." If I can find the remote control, I will show you some slides involving Woodson. I recently acquired this photograph from a Harvard professor who's writing a book about Woodson and education. and this is one I hadn't seen before. I had suggested when he was writing his book, he wanted to see what the State Archives had. And he told me he got this photograph from the State Archives. And I blew a lid because, I thought I had everything that the State Archives had. But it turns out he got this from West Virginia State Archives, West Virginia State University. And supposedly, if you look at the top step, you see the woman at the top. If you count down to the fourth person, supposedly that's Woodson. From the top step down the fourth person. You see two women, a man, and then that looks like Woodson, doesn't it? I haven't shown it to any of Woodson's relatives, but I think it's probably Woodson. And he says this was this was taken in 1896. And remember I told you that Woodson replaced his cousin as principal at Douglas High School? Supposedly the gentleman at the bottom right with the hat is Carter H. Barnett, Woodson's first cousin. I don't know what Barnett looks like. I've never seen a photograph of him, but I'm eager to show it to his relatives to verify. But it's a great find. You can't find any new photographs of Woodson. This is something extraordinary, so I'm really excited about that. Let's see if I can go to the next one. Okay, and this one I think you've seen many times. This one is in my book. I purchased this from the Spurlock collection in the National Archives, and you see this very often because people like to see the young Carter G. Woodson. Alan Gould, some of you may know, former provost at Marshall and founding executive director of the Drinko Academy, would never let me use old pictures of Woodson. He always wanted the young pictures. I don't know whether it was an old man wanting to look young and he thought all old men should look young. And this is the old man. I purchased these photographs for my book while Alan was very ill. And so he did not know that I had all these old pictures of Woodson. I think he looks very distinguished and scholarly in his library. Yet young men don't hang out in libraries, do they? You see the white woman in the light-colored hat there, the third person from the right? Does anyone know who that is? A West Virginian, first name Pearl Buck. This is the 25th anniversary of dinner in which Woodson celebrated the 25th anniversary of the founding of his association in Chicago, and Pearl Buck attended the dinner. Now, I mentioned Robert Abbott, the founder of the Chicago Defender, probably the first black millionaire. That's him sitting to Pearl Buck's left. Woodson's home in Washington is now a National Historic Site and run by the National Park Service. And this young lady conducted the tour that I took in December when I was seeing his home for the first time inside. And she had lots of misinformation, and I held my tongue. And at the end, I introduced myself, and a couple of other rangers recognized my name because they had seen my book. And I asked her to take a selfie with her, and once she realized who I was, she said, "What are you going to do? Tell people I got everything wrong?" I said, No, I won't do that. I'm a journalist. We just report what we see. This is the outside of Woodson's home. It's on 9th Street in Northwest Washington, just down the street from the Renaissance Hotel we consider the Renaissance as downtown Washington now, but in those days it would not have been considered downtown. But it's right up this home is right up the hill from there. The neighborhood has become very gentrified. This is a photograph I took at a birthday celebration. This was in 2013, and it looks like a funeral, doesn't it? But they have all the flowers up front, and his photograph there, and there are at least 300 people in this church. This is a church where Woodson's funeral was held in 1950. It's just a couple of doors down from his home. This is the birthday celebration this past December. Again, hundreds of people show up to celebrate his birthday. And this is the cake. I didn't eat cake that day, but it looked very good. I tried to behave and not eat a lot of sugar. And there were 300 people there, so I didn't want 300 witnesses that I was cheating. Joe mentioned that we had a Black History Institute for high school teachers, summer 2017. These are the teachers and some Marshall faculty and administrators in that group. So you may recognize some people there. Okay, it's a nice shot. This is a close-up shot of Woodson's statue in Huntington. Have all of you seen Woodson's statue? Okay. And this is in 1995 when the statue was dedicated. This is a relatively new park in Washington, the Carter G. Woodson Park, a half block from his home in Washington. In 2017, we began a Black History poster contest, and this is the winning photograph for 2017. And much of the Woodson Lyceum publicity included the posters. Now, this is the first time I mentioned the Lyceum, or at least I didn't explain it the first time I mentioned it. We created the Lyceum to honor Woodson, and 2 years ago, and we didn't want to use the word institute because there are lots of institutes, and so we wanted to sound exotic. And a lot of people don't know what a Lyceum is, and that's okay. It allows us to explain what it is and fundraise. Once you know what it is, you want to give. So I have my card in case you guys want to send in checks. This is the winning poster for 2018. Dr. Miller was on the selection committee, and I'm sure she recalls how excited people were over the finalists for the winning selection. And this one I thought was outstanding. The theme of the contest of Black History for 2018 is African Americans in times of war. And I think the student captured that very well. Someone complained that it looked somewhat hawkish, but, that happens in a war, right? There are bullets. This is Woodson's, we believe to be Woodson's final letter to Luther P. Jackson, who was a history professor at Virginia State University, and Woodson's biggest fundraiser in the state. And he wrote this letter on April 1st, 1950, and died on April 3rd, 1950. And this is the substance of the letter here. He says, "Thank you very much for your check of $500. He was always concerned about money, just like we are at the Lyceum. We count all the nickels and the dimes. Thank you very much for your check of $500, which we have deposited for credit to the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. We are delighted to have this money at the time when we must meet pressing obligations which accumulate rapidly during this season. The unfailing support which we receive from Virginia brings us increasing assurance that we can survive. We are emphasizing the fine record of Virginia as an example that other parts should follow. I am sure that those who have improved considerably during the last few years have been very much influenced by this record made under your guidance. You may be interested in knowing that friends in West Virginia are now trying to emulate your example." Basically on his deathbed, he felt he was dying. He had been dying for the last 2 weeks. But on his deathbed, he was still concerned about people in the state of West Virginia. I'm just going to play a short segment.
The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History is to collect the records of the Negro and to treat them scientifically in order that the race may not become a negligible factor in the thought of the world. The past of the Negro race has been so obscured and belittled by propagandists that little is known of the credible record of the race. Today, as a rule, we take notice only of the undesirable Negroes and ignore those who are struggling to climb upward. To turn the attention of the public in the more desirable direction, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History was organized in Chicago, September 9, 1915. This society publishes magazines, researches in Negro history, directs studies in clubs and schools, promotes the home study of the Negro by mail, produces texts on the Negro for schools and colleges, collects and preserves valuable documents of Negro history, supplies libraries with special collections of rare books on the Negro, and educates promising and enterprising young men for service in historical research. The Association for the Study of Negro Life and History finds by scientific investigation that the record of the Negro is not to be despised. Even in Africa, the Negro race has achieved much for which it has not been given credit. There are historians and anthropologists who say that
I just wanted you guys to hear his voice. It's only about 10 minutes, and it's a national broadcast in the late 1930s on NBC radio. I haven't found his voice anywhere else, and so I was delighted to get my hands on it. Because I always wondered, what did he sound like? But he sounds like all the educated people I've heard before from the 1930s. This could be Roosevelt speaking. There's a certain sound to educated men and women from that period. And I'm going to end this by showing you a 39-second video, also the only video I have been able to find on Woodson. But it's Woodson in his office. He's an older man, and so Alan won't be here to see it. So do I hit advance? Okay. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Okay.
Do you
Yes,
know
sir.
anything about the Carter G. Woodson Grade School in St. Albans?
Yes. I spoke to the St. Albans Historical Society in April. There were two schools named Carter G. Woodson, but over time they took his name off. Well, one is a VFW, I believe, and there was a gentleman there who wants to put a plaque in Woodson's honor at the VFW.
So there was one at the VFW. What about the
There was
one?
a second one. Mm-hmm. There were two. Mhm. And for some reason, the name was changed. Not many people know that there was a Woodson school or two schools in his honor.
All the African-American children that I would talk to when I was growing up, I would ask them where they went to school.
Yeah.
And they would say Carter G. Woodson, and I had no idea what they were talking about.
Yeah. Woodson wrote a book called "The Early Education of Negroes in West Virginia," something similar to that title, in which he says that the original proposal for the location of West Virginia State University was St. Albans. Yeah. Apparently there was a thriving black community there once. Mm-hmm. Yeah, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Was Martin Luther King influenced by Carter G. Woodson in the early, especially during the early 60s?
Funny you should ask. I thought I was going too long, so I cut that out of my presentation. Woodson, I don't know if Woodson and King ever met, but they had common friends. I mentioned Reddick, who was at the Schomburg Center, who said African American history can be characterized as two periods, before Woodson and after Woodson. He was one of the first biographers of King, and he knew King very well, and he was also a Woodson boy. There were a handful of historians like Reddick and John Hope Franklin considered to be very close to Woodson. And there is the former Morehouse College president, whose name I forget, was a friend of both Woodson and Martin Luther King. And King considered him to be his mentor. Mm-hmm. And they had all these things in common. Even Woodson's association invited King to be the Negro history speaker in the 1950s. And King gave numerous speeches during Negro History Week that sounded like something Woodson could have given himself.
I know he found it important in the early 1960s with the early, education and of Negro voters in the hollows of West Virginia. I know I worked with Reverend Newsom back in those days. I was always wondering whether part of his strategy, because Martin Luther King was seriously influenced by Gandhi, of course, and so whether or not that may have been a two-part strategy or part of his plan.
Benjamin Mays was the name I couldn't remember. Benjamin Mays was King's mentor, and he was a close friend of Woodson's. Woodson influenced a lot of the people, both moderates and radicals in the civil rights movement. Malcolm X said he learned a lot about African history from Woodson's writings. And several of the Black Panthers read Woodson, studied Woodson, quoted Woodson. Any others? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay.
I was just going to ask you if you might want to share some of the Lyceum's plans for, I know things are still in the planning
Yeah.
stage, but just to invite everybody to come to Marshall for the
Yes.
Lyceum program?
Yes. One of our big events will be February 7th. We have a Professor Emeritus from William and Mary who, for 20 years, ran a program there on slavery and the first Africans coming to America. An event that few people in our community have recognized that's fast approaching is 1619, when the first Africans arrived in America and the first English women, white women, arrived in America. And so we're going to recognize that with an event on February 7th. We will publicize it and hope that you will be able to attend it as well. We also have some other speakers that we're lining up. I can't tell you who they are because they have not confirmed yet, but we will have an entire month of celebrating Black history with an emphasis on Carter G. Woodson. Again, thank you so much.
I think you're going to tell us what Lyceum is.
Oh, you want a Lyceum story? Okay. If you're not in a hurry, I'll tell you some more stories. Aristotle's first school in 335 BC was called the Lyceum. And Alan Gould is a historian, and he came up with the idea for the Lyceum. And I said, that's a great idea. I love the name. I'm an Ole Miss graduate, and the first building in the state of Mississippi in higher education is the Lyceum at the University of Mississippi. And I said, that's terrific. I said, let's go with it. And then, and he said, the Lyceum overlooked a grove. I said, that's even better. So does the Ole Miss Lyceum. I said, we have one problem. Our new president, Dr. Gilbert, is from Mississippi State University. He said, oh, you don't think he knows anything about the Lyceum? I said, well, I bet he does. But fortunately, Dr. Gilbert has not complained. He thinks it's funny. And so we like that. Yes, you're welcome.